On the morning of my wedding, just when I thought nothing could ruin the day, my parents dropped a bombshell that would haunt me forever. They told me they weren't coming. Not because they were sick, not because of an accident, but because they were embarrassed. Embarrassed that their daughter was marrying a plumber. Sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end of this story. My name is Emily Carter, and I grew up in what most people would call a dream. A mansion in Pacific Heights with sweeping views of San Francisco Bay, parents who built a $200 million real estate empire, and a life that seemed flawless on the outside. But let me tell you something I've learned the hard way: appearances lie. From the very beginning, love in my family was a transaction. My younger sister Olivia was the golden child, adored for her charm and grace. I was the quiet one, the bookworm, the achiever who never seemed to measure up. No matter how hard I worked, it was never enough to earn their pride. So, when I fell in love with Daniel, a man who happened to own a plumbing business, I knew introducing him to my parents would be difficult. What I didn't expect was outright rejection. That morning, as I stood in my wedding dress, my mother's voice came through the phone like a knife. "Emily, we won't be attending today. Enjoy marrying your plumber. We won't be embarrassed with you." She hung up before I could even respond. The words echoed in my head, bouncing against every fragile part of me that had once longed for their approval. My hands trembled so violently that I nearly dropped the phone. My best friend tried to comfort me, but I couldn't stop the tears. It wasn't just that my parents were absent. It was that they chose to humiliate me on what should have been the happiest day of my life. And yet, in that moment of devastation, something unexpected happened inside me. Beneath the hurt, a strange calm began to form. For years I had measured my worth by their standards, twisted myself into someone they might finally love. But in that instant, I realized their rejection said more about them than it ever did about me. What my parents didn't know was that Daniel wasn't the man they thought he was. Yes, he was a plumber. But he was also so much more smarter, stronger, and more ambitious than any of the men they paraded in front of me. And the photo I sent them later that night? That photo revealed a truth so powerful it sent them into a panic, blowing up my phone with calls they never would have made otherwise. But before I tell you what that photo showed, let me ask you something. Have you ever faced a moment when the people who were supposed to love you the most became the ones who cut you down the hardest? How did you handle it? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if you're just as curious about what happens next, make sure you like this video, hit subscribe, and stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change the way you think about family, love, and what really matters. That morning, as I wiped my tears and forced myself to breathe, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. My parents had made their choice. Now it was time for me to make mine. And as the clock ticked closer to 4 o'clock, the hour when I was supposed to walk down the aisle, I decided I would not let their absence ruin my day. Because the truth was, this story was just getting started. I grew up in a house that everyone in San Francisco knew, the kind of place that made strangers stop and stare from the sidewalk. Our mansion stood proudly in Pacific Heights, a symbol of my parents' success. People looked at our polished facade, the manicured gardens, the glossy black gates, and thought we were the perfect family. What they didn't see were the cracks inside those walls, cracks that had been forming long before I could even understand what they meant. My father, Charles Carter, and my mother, Victoria, built Carter Real Estate Group from nothing into an empire. By the time I was born, they were rubbing elbows with politicians, socialites, and business magnates. Our dinner table conversations weren't about school or feelings, they were about deals, connections, and who made the guest list for the next gala. As their eldest daughter, I thought that made me special. But in their eyes, my younger sister Olivia always outshone me. From my earliest memories, I lived in her shadow. Olivia had a way of making people fall in love with her instantly. She was graceful without trying, witty without effort, and had a knack for charming adults at every event. Meanwhile, I was the child who tripped on her dress shoes, who blushed too easily, who preferred burying her nose in a book rather than fluttering around cocktail parties. One evening stands out vividly in my mind. I was 8 years old, sitting at our massive dining table during one of my parents' infamous dinner parties. The long mahogany table gleamed under the chandelier, and every guest was dressed in black tie elegance. I sat stiffly in my seat, desperate to please, balancing my fork perfectly in the way I'd practiced. Across from me, Olivia, just 6 years old, giggled as she told a clumsy joke to one of my father's investors. The table erupted in laughter, glasses clinking. "See, Emily," my mother leaned toward me, her lips painted in her signature red. "That's how you make an impression." Heat rose in my cheeks as I stared down at my plate. I thought if I ate quietly, I would at least avoid drawing the wrong kind of attention, but even silence wasn't safe. "Emily, don't slouch," my father barked softly, his eyes flashing irritation. "Olivia, dear, sit up straight like you." It was always like that. Olivia was the example, and I was the warning. Years later, the disparities only grew sharper. When I proudly handed my father a report card filled with straight A's in 3rd grade, he barely glanced at it before muttering, "Good job," and returning to his computer. A week later, Olivia brought home B's and C's, and they whisked her out for ice cream and bought her a new dress because she tried her best. At 16, the gap became undeniable. My birthday came first. I opened an envelope from my parents, inside a crisp $50 bill. My father patted my shoulder. "Be responsible with it." 3 months later, Olivia's 16th arrived. I watched from the front steps as they unveiled a sparkling new BMW convertible, a giant red bow glistening under the sundae. The look on my face must have betrayed me, because my mother placed a hand on my arm and said, "Your sister is more social, darling. She needs a car to see her friends. You just go to the library anyway." The truth was, she was right. I did go to the library. Books became my refuge, the one place where effort equaled reward, where no one could overshadow me. I spent hours in those hushed halls, soaking in knowledge while my parents paraded Olivia through the city's elite circles. By the time high school ended, I had achieved everything they said mattered. Valedictorian, scholarships, endless accolades. But even at my graduation, as I gave my speech, my parents slipped out early, murmuring something about a charity gala. I watched them leave from the stage, my heart breaking quietly behind my practiced smile. That was the moment I understood the truth. No accomplishment of mine would ever be enough. My parents valued charisma over character, charm over discipline, appearances over authenticity, and as much as it hurt, I realized I had a choice. I could keep chasing their approval, or I could start writing my own story. That choice would come sooner than I expected, and it would change everything because college was waiting, and with it, an independence I never knew I craved. Stanford was supposed to be my fresh start, the place where I could finally prove myself without Olivia standing in the spotlight. I remember the day the acceptance letter arrived. My hands shook as I ripped open the envelope, and when I saw the words "full academic scholarship," tears blurred the page. It was everything I had worked for, everything my parents said they wanted. But when I told them, their reaction wasn't what I imagined. "That's wonderful, Emily," my mother said, her voice flat. "But you'll still need to take out student loans. You need to learn the value of money." I stood there in disbelief. We lived in a mansion worth more than most people would make in a lifetime, yet my parents were determined that I struggle. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, and accepted their decree. That night, I overheard my father on the phone with Olivia, already planning to cover her full tuition and housing at NYU. Not just that she would have a monthly allowance, a credit card, even money for shopping trips and vacations. I told myself I didn't care, but the truth is, it cut me to the core. So I threw myself into survival. My first year at Stanford, I worked 20 hours a week at the campus bookstore, shelving heavy textbooks and ringing up students who never noticed the exhaustion in my eyes. I studied late into the night in dim dorm lounges, fueled by vending machine coffee and the relentless fear of failing. There were times I wanted to give up, to crawl back home and demand the support I knew they were giving Olivia without question. But pride kept me going. Every time I deposited a paycheck into my near-empty account, every time I scraped together enough for groceries, every time I managed to pay a bill without asking for help, I felt a spark of something new, something stronger than their approval: independence. The years blurred into a cycle of work, study, and silent triumphs. By my senior year, I had maintained a perfect GPA, even as I juggled jobs and internships. When my old laptop died, I saved for 3 months to replace it, while Olivia bragged about her brand new MacBook Pro that Dad had ordered overnight because she needed it for design projects. Graduation was supposed to be my moment of redemption. I was named valedictorian. I wrote a speech that poured out my heart about resilience, determination, and finding meaning in the struggle. My parents sat in the front row, expressionless as I spoke. And then, before the ceremony ended, they slipped out quietly. I caught sight of my father glancing at his watch as he whispered to my mother. They were late for a charity gala. I finished my speech to a sea of strangers, my heart hollowed out. That night, sitting alone in my dorm room surrounded by cardboard boxes, I finally made a promise to myself. I would stop trying to win them over. I would no longer measure my worth by their standards. I moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment in Berkeley. The furniture was secondhand, the dishes mismatched, the walls bare. But it was mine. Every paycheck I earned paid for something tangible: a lamp, a rug, a couch that sagged but held me at the end of long days. Each piece represented not just money, but freedom. For the first time, I felt proud of my life without needing their validation. When my parents called, the conversations were surface level. My mother asked about work, my father mentioned business deals, and always, the question hung between us unspoken. Why wasn't I more like Olivia? I stopped craving an answer. The loneliness stung sometimes, but it was bearable because it was my loneliness, my choice. I was building a life brick by brick, one they couldn't claim as their own. I didn't know it then, but that foundation, those years of quiet defiance, would prepare me for the storm that was coming. Because just when I thought I had carved out my independence, fate sent me someone who would test every wall I had built. And it all started on a rainy Tuesday in Berkeley, when a burst pipe flooded my bathroom and a stranger with kind eyes showed up at my door. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day you barely remember until it becomes unforgettable. Rain pounded against my apartment windows, the kind of relentless California storm that makes you wonder if the city was ever built to handle weather at all. I had just finished dinner when I heard it, a strange, low groan from the bathroom pipes, followed by the unmistakable sound of rushing water. By the time I reached the door, water was gushing across the tiled floor, spilling into the hallway like an unstoppable tide. Panic surged through me. I scrambled for towels, anything to slow it down, but the force was too strong. My phone trembled in my hand as I dialed the emergency plumber number. The dispatcher's calm voice promised, "Someone will be there within an hour." I hung up and stood barefoot in cold water, watching it creep closer to the carpet in my bedroom. 53 minutes later, a knock at the door cut through the storm. When I opened it, I expected a frazzled worker with muddy boots and a bad attitude. Instead, I found a tall man with warm brown eyes and a smile that reached all the way to them. He wore jeans, work boots, and a navy polo with Wilson Plumbing embroidered on the chest. A heavy toolbox hung from his hand, but his presence was steady, grounding, like someone who had walked into chaos 100 times and knew exactly what to do. "Hi, I'm Daniel," he said, his voice low and calm, with just the faintest hint of a Bay Area accent. "Heard you've got yourself a water problem." The understatement almost made me laugh through my panic. "You could say that." He stepped inside, assessed the situation in seconds, and headed straight for the shut-off valve. The sound of rushing water stopped, leaving only the patter of rain outside and the frantic beating of my heart. He knelt by the broken pipe, pulling out tools with practiced precision. I hovered nearby, useless but strangely unwilling to leave the room. As he worked, he glanced up at me. "So, What do you do when you're not fighting indoor floods? His tone wasn't just polite filler, it was genuine curiosity. I told him I worked in financial consulting, expecting the same glazed over reaction I usually got. But instead, he leaned into the conversation. Interesting. Have you noticed how market patterns have shifted since the tech bubble started cooling? I blinked, surprised. Most people didn't even know what I did, let alone cared. I found myself explaining recent trends, and to my shock, he asked sharp, thoughtful questions. Then the conversation drifted to books, and before I knew it, we were trading opinions on biographies of historical figures, debating which leader had left the most lasting impact. Hours passed without my noticing. By the time Daniel tightened the last bolt and stood, water cleaned up and the pipe secure, I realized something unsettling. I didn't want him to leave. He handed me his card. Call me if you have any more plumbing emergencies, or if you'd like to continue our debate about 19th century politics. His smile lingered in my mind long after the door closed behind him. For days afterward, I found myself replaying that night. The calm way he handled the disaster, the intelligence hidden behind his easy humor, the warmth in his eyes. I had met plenty of men through my parents' circles, smooth-talking lawyers, ambitious investors, heirs to companies I was supposed to admire. None of them made me feel seen. But Daniel, in the middle of a flooded apartment, had done just that. The following Saturday, I surprised myself by calling the number on his card, not because of another plumbing issue, but because I wanted to see him again. We agreed to meet for coffee at a small cafe in the Mission District. I told myself it was casual, just a thank you, but deep down, I knew it was the beginning of something bigger. What I didn't know then was just how much bigger. That coffee date would turn into hours of effortless conversation, and those hours would spark something I never expected. My life, carefully built on independence and walls against disappointment, was about to be shaken in ways I could never have imagined. And the first cracks in those walls had started with the sound of a burst pipe. I'll never forget the night I brought Daniel to meet my parents. For weeks, I went back and forth in my head, convincing myself that maybe this time would be different. Maybe they would see what I saw in him, a man who was thoughtful, kind, intelligent, and grounded in a way money could never buy. But as the date of the family dinner approached, dread sank into my chest like a stone. The Carter estate in Pacific Heights glittered that night, its tall windows glowing with warm light that felt anything but welcoming. The valet whisked away our car as we walked up the steps. Daniel held my hand tightly, giving me one of his steady smiles. "It'll be fine," he whispered. I wanted to believe him. Inside, the familiar scent of my mother's favorite lilies filled the air. The dining room table stretched endlessly, set with crystal glasses and silver polished so bright it reflected the chandelier. My parents stood at the head of the table like royalty receiving guests. "Mother, father, this is Daniel," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "He owns his own business. He's a plumber." For a second, silence hung heavy. My father's smile froze in place, stiff and unnatural. My mother's eyebrows twitched upward, so slight most people wouldn't have noticed. But I knew her tells. "How interesting," she said, her voice smooth as glass. Daniel extended his hand to my father, who shook it with a politeness that felt more like a dismissal. We took our seats, and the conversation began, or rather, the performance did. My parents directed their energy toward Olivia and her boyfriend, Ethan Whitmore, who sat across from us. Ethan, the son of a luxury hotel magnate, was everything they had ever wanted for a son-in-law. Polished, connected, wealthy by birthright. They asked about his recent trip to Paris, about his father's latest expansion project, about the high-profile guests at their properties. Every answer Ethan gave earned smiles and laughter. Daniel tried to engage. He asked my father about Carter Real Estate's new development, and for a moment, I thought maybe there was hope. But my father cut him off mid-sentence to pivot back to Ethan. My mother leaned forward, hanging on Olivia's every word as she described a gala they'd attended, as if Daniel didn't even exist at the table. I felt the humiliation rise in waves. Each time they ignored him, each time they changed the subject, a knot tightened in my stomach. Daniel, to his credit, remained calm. He ate politely, asked thoughtful questions, even complimented my mother on her cooking. His composure only made their rudeness more unbearable. At one point, Olivia turned to me with a too-sweet smile. "Emily, isn't it wonderful that Ethan and I are planning a trip to Rome next month? Maybe you and Daniel could come? Oh wait, I forgot. Plumbing doesn't exactly come with international perks. Does it?" The table erupted in laughter. My parents didn't correct her. They didn't even flinch. I stared at my plate, my face burning with shame and fury. Daniel reached under the table and gave my hand a gentle squeeze, as if to remind me that we were in this together. After dessert, my mother finally addressed him directly. "So, Daniel, how did you and Emily meet?" I explained about the burst pipe, about how he had come to the rescue. My mother's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. How quaint! When the evening finally ended, I could barely breathe until we were back in the car. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "They were horrible to you." Daniel squeezed my hand again. "Emily, you never have to apologize for other people's behavior, not even your parents." I wanted to believe him, but the ache inside me told another story. I had hoped for acceptance, for just a sliver of recognition that he was worthy of me. Instead, my parents made it clear, in their eyes, he never would be. And yet, Daniel's calm strength that night planted something in me, something that would grow stronger with every test that followed. Because as painful as that dinner was, it was only the beginning. Soon, my parents would have another chance to show how little they valued the man I loved, and the stage would be set for a revelation that would change everything. The invitation arrived on cream-colored stationery, embossed with my parents' crest, as if they were European nobility. They wanted me and Daniel to spend a weekend at the family vineyard in Napa Valley. On the surface, it sounded pleasant. A chance to relax among the rolling hills of grapevines, far away from the bustle of San Francisco. But I knew better. Every family weekend was more performance than gathering. Another stage where my parents paraded wealth and influence like armor. Still, against my instincts, I said yes. A small part of me hoped they might finally soften, might finally see Daniel as I did. The vineyard estate was as imposing as ever when we arrived. Rows of vines stretched into the horizon, kissed by golden sunlight, and the house itself looked like it had been plucked from Tuscany. My mother greeted us in a linen dress, a glass of Chardonnay in hand, her smile tight. "Emily, Daniel, so glad you could make it." The words sounded rehearsed. Dinner that night was set under strings of glowing lights in the courtyard. A long table overflowed with roasted lamb, fresh bread, and endless bottles of wine. Olivia and Ethan dominated the conversation, speaking loudly about their recent trip to Milan. My father leaned in, eyes sparkling, as Ethan recounted their private shopping tour with a famous Italian designer. Daniel tried to participate. He asked my father about the vineyard's new expansion project, curious about the business model. My father answered with curt, clipped sentences before steering the conversation back to Ethan, who eagerly launched into a story about meeting a hotel investor in Paris. Every word seemed chosen to exclude Daniel, as if my parents believed he couldn't possibly keep up. The small slights piled up. My mother accidentally set only 5 places at the 6-person table, forcing Daniel to pull over a chair. When dessert was served, she praised Olivia's refined palate for detecting hints of vanilla in the custard, while pointedly ignoring Daniel's thoughtful observation about the vineyard's soil. At one point, Olivia laughed and said, "You know, Ethan and I are thinking of buying a villa in France. Maybe you and Daniel could visit us there. Though I suppose international travel is a little out of reach for some people." My parents chuckled. I felt heat rise in my face. My grip on the stem of my wineglass tightened until I thought it might shatter. Every cruel omission, every patronizing smile, every deliberate dismissal, it was all too much. I stole a glance at Daniel. He sat calmly, shoulders relaxed, his expression unreadable. He wasn't rattled, and that steadiness almost broke me. Later, as the evening wound down, we slipped away from the noise and walked down a dirt path between the rows of vines. The night air was cool. The stars spread endlessly above us, the hum of laughter fading behind. That was when the weight of the night crashed over me. I stopped walking, burying my face in my hands as hot tears spilled out. "I'm so sorry," I choked. "They were so awful. I don't understand why they can't see you the way I do." Daniel wrapped his arms around me, pulling me close against his chest. His voice was gentle, but there was something deeper in it too, something that made me look up. "Emily, they see me exactly how they want to see me. That has nothing to do with who I really am." His words cut through my grief like a thread of light. I searched his eyes, but he just smiled faintly, almost secretively. "What do you mean?" I whispered. He brushed a strand of hair from my face. "There's something I haven't told you yet. Something I think you should see for yourself when we get back to the city." A mix of confusion and anticipation surged inside me. I wanted to demand answers right there in the vineyard, but the quiet confidence in his voice held me still. I sensed that whatever secret he was carrying was big enough to change everything I thought I knew about him. As we walked back toward the glow of the estate, my heart pounded with a strange mix of dread and hope. I didn't know it then, but Daniel was about to reveal a truth that would shatter every assumption my parents had ever made and prove to me that love, real love, could never be measured by appearances alone. The following weekend, Daniel asked me to come to his place for dinner. I had never been there before, and truthfully, I didn't know what to expect. He lived in Oakland, in a modest building tucked away on a quiet street. It was the kind of place you might walk past without noticing, so unlike the palatial homes I had grown up around. But the moment he opened the door and let me in, I realized appearances were deceiving. His apartment was nothing like I imagined. The space was open, carefully arranged, filled with light. Bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling, crammed with volumes that ranged from classic literature to technical manuals I couldn't even begin to understand. A large desk sat near the window, covered with neatly stacked journals and a scattering of sketches. The air carried the faint scent of fresh wood shavings and ink, as though the room itself was alive with ideas. While Daniel moved into the kitchen to check on dinner, I wandered closer to the desk. Curiosity pulled me toward the diagrams. At first, they looked like complex plumbing systems, but as I traced the lines and annotations, I realized they were far more advanced. Valves connected to sensors, circuits running alongside pipes, calculations scribbled in margins. It looked less like plumbing and more like engineering. I turned to him, my voice tentative. "Daniel, what is all this?" He walked over, wiping his hands on a towel, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw a flicker of nervousness in his eyes. He set the towel down, pulled out a chair, and motioned for me to sit. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about," he said softly. "I haven't been completely honest with you, not because I wanted to deceive you, but because I needed you to know me as I am, not as some title or resume." My chest tightened. "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath. "I didn't start out as a plumber. I have a degree in electrical engineering from MIT. For 6 years I worked at Talbot Technologies in Silicon Valley as a senior systems engineer. On paper, I had it all: salary, prestige, recognition. But the work was suffocating. 80-hour weeks designing components for military applications. It didn't feel like I was building anything that mattered." I stared at him, struggling to process his words. MIT, senior engineer. It didn't line up with the man everyone dismissed so casually. He continued, his voice steadier now. "When my father got sick, I took a leave of absence to help with his plumbing business. I thought it would be temporary, but something unexpected happened. I discovered I loved it. I loved solving real problems for real people. I loved walking away from a job knowing I had made someone's life better. So when my father recovered, I decided not to go back. I took over the business." He reached for the stack of folders on the desk and handed one to me. Inside were patent documents, schematics, and technical specifications stamped with official seals. But I never stopped being an engineer. For the past 3 years, I've been developing this hydro-save systems. It's a smart water conservation technology for residential use. It reduces household water consumption by up to 60% without requiring people to change their habits. I've been testing prototypes in clients' homes, refining the system with real-world data. Last month, the patent was approved. I'm already in talks with venture capital firms. The words blurred as I stared at the papers in my hands. Hydrosave, patent numbers, technical drawings that looked like another language. This was real. My heart raced with a strange mix of pride and shock. "Daniel, why didn't you tell me any of this?" I asked quietly. He reached for my hands across the desk. "Because you loved me as Daniel the plumber, not Daniel the engineer, not Daniel the potential CEO. That meant more to me than anything." Tears stung my eyes. For years, I had been measured by titles, achievements, appearances, all the things my parents worshipped. And here was a man who had hidden his accomplishments, not because he lacked pride, but because he wanted to be valued for who he was at his core. That night, as the scent of roasted vegetables drifted in from the kitchen, Daniel dropped to one knee and opened a small box. Inside was a sapphire ring surrounded by tiny diamonds, elegant and understated. "Emily," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion, "you saw me before anyone else did. You saw me for who I am, not what I do. Will you marry me?" The answer came before I even realized I had spoken. "Yes, yes, I will." As I slipped the ring onto my finger, I felt my world shift. For the first time in my life, I wasn't bound by my parents' definitions of success. I was building a future with a man who valued character over credentials, love over appearances. I didn't know it then, but saying yes that night would ignite a storm within my family. Because while Daniel and I planned a simple, honest wedding, my sister's engagement was unfolding in a very different way, one that would put our lives on a collision course. When Daniel slipped the sapphire ring on my finger, I thought the hardest part was behind us. I believed love would be enough, that my parents would look past their shallow standards once they saw how happy we were. But their reaction to our engagement proved how wrong I was. I called my mother first, my heart pounding with nervous excitement. "Mom," I said, "Daniel proposed." I said yes. There was a pause long enough to make me check if the line had gone dead. Then her voice came, cool and detached. "Well, that's quite a surprise. Emily, have you really thought this through?" Not a word of congratulations. No joy. Just doubt dripping with judgment. My father was even worse when I called him later. "This is a phase," he said dismissively. "When you're serious about your future, we'll introduce you to someone more suitable." It stung, but I told myself it didn't matter. Daniel and I would plan a wedding that reflected us, simple, intimate, and honest. No extravagance, no show, just love. We chose the Japanese tea garden in Golden Gate Park, a place filled with quiet beauty. The ceremony would be small, just close friends and a handful of relatives who actually cared about us. Meanwhile, Olivia's engagement to Ethan had exploded into a spectacle. Within days of her announcement, my parents threw an elaborate engagement party at their country club, complete with a champagne fountain and a string quartet. Every society page in San Francisco featured her smiling face and the massive diamond on her finger. My parents beamed in every photograph, as though her engagement were their crowning achievement. Our family dinners became planning sessions for Olivia's wedding. I sat silently at the table while my mother and sister debated between orchids and lilies, while my father boasted about the $300,000 he had set aside to ensure only the best for my little girl. When I timidly mentioned that Daniel and I had chosen the tea garden for our ceremony, my mother waved her hand dismissively. "Well, that sounds economical. I suppose it suits your circumstances." I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. It wasn't about economics, it was about meaning. But to them, meaning was worthless if it couldn't be displayed in glossy magazines. The contrast between our weddings widened with each passing week. Olivia's bridal shower cost more than our entire budget. She modeled couture gowns flown in from New York while I searched for a dress I could afford without going into debt. She invited 500 guests. Our guest list barely reached 50. And still, my parents never offered to help, never asked how our planning was going. It was as if my wedding didn't exist at all. The final blow came 2 weeks before my ceremony. I called my parents one last time, clinging to a shred of hope. The wedding is on the 12th at 4 o'clock. Will you be there? My mother's voice was syrupy sweet, the kind of tone she used when lying. Oh, Emily, I'm afraid your father has a very important meeting with investors from Dubai. We simply can't miss it. I'm sure your little wedding will be lovely though. My throat closed. I pressed the phone harder to my ear. But it's my wedding day. Her tone hardened. And it was your choice to marry him. We won't be embarrassed with you. The line went dead. I sat on the edge of my bed, the words echoing inside me. Not only were they refusing to come, they were making it clear they saw my marriage as shameful, a blemish on their polished image. For a moment, I felt the old desperation rise, the need to fight, to prove myself, to beg for their approval. But then Daniel's voice echoed in my mind. You loved me as I am. That means everything. The pain of their rejection was sharp, but underneath it, a new strength began to form. If they couldn't see the value in the life I was building, then maybe I didn't need them there at all. What I didn't realize was that their absence at my wedding would not be the end of the story. Because while they turned their backs on me, I would soon have the chance to turn the tables on them in a way they never saw coming. And it would all begin with a single photograph. The morning of my wedding felt like stepping into a dream I wasn't sure I was allowed to have. The Japanese tea garden in Golden Gate Park was alive with colored cherry blossoms trembling in the breeze, koi gliding silently beneath the bridges, lanterns swaying softly against the sky. My dress wasn't designer, but as Lisa, my best friend, fastened the last button and whispered, "You look beautiful," I believed her. And then the silence hit me. There were empty seats at the front row of the pavilion. Seats reserved for my parents, seats that would stay empty no matter how many times I glanced at them, hoping for a last-minute miracle. Every step I took toward the aisle, my heart ached with that absence. But when Uncle Michael appeared at my side, his arm steady as he offered it to me, I felt something shift. Your parents made their choice, he whispered, but I made mine. Let me walk you down the aisle. I nodded, tears threatening to spill. But this time they weren't tears of grief alone, they were tears of gratitude. The ceremony was nothing like the Carter spectacles I had grown up attending. It was intimate, raw, filled with laughter and real emotion. Daniel's eyes met mine with a warmth that burned away every shadow of doubt. We spoke vows we had written ourselves, words that weren't about money or appearances but about patience, partnership, and love. When we kissed, the small crowd erupted in cheers, and for the first time in years, I felt free. The reception was held under strings of fairy lights, tables adorned with wildflowers in mason jars, music floating from a simple speaker setup. Daniel's parents embraced me as though I had always been their daughter, his mother whispering, "He's never been happier than he is with you." I danced with Daniel barefoot on the grass, laughter spilling out of me until my cheeks ached. For hours, I forgot the ache of what was missing. It wasn't until later that night, after the last guest had left and the lights had dimmed, that the emptiness returned. My parents hadn't just skipped my wedding, they had disowned me with a single sentence. "We won't be embarrassed with you." The words still burned in my ears. I wanted to move on, to shut them out of my heart forever, but a stubborn part of me still longed for them to know the truth. Daniel was talking with a small group of old colleagues, men and women whose suits and quiet confidence hinted at a world far beyond plumbing. Behind them hung a simple, congratulatory banner. "Congratulations, Daniel Brooks, CEO of HydroSave Systems." Someone snapped a photo of the moment, capturing Daniel mid-laugh, his colleagues raising glasses around him, the banner bold in the background. I stared at that image on my phone, my pulse quickening. It was more than a photo. It was proof. Proof that the man my parents dismissed as unworthy was building something bigger than they could imagine. Proof that their narrow definition of success was blinding them to what really mattered. Proof that love and brilliance could exist in the same man, no matter what label they tried to pin on him. Without hesitation, I typed a short message, "Thought you might like to see a picture from the wedding you missed." Then I attached the photo and hit send. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the screen, my thumb hovering over the power button. Then, with a strange calm, I turned off my phone completely. I didn't want to see their reactions, not yet. Tonight was mine and Daniel's. Tonight belonged to love, not to the people who had chosen pride over family. I slipped the phone into my bag and joined Daniel on the dance floor one last time. His hand found mine, strong and steady, grounding me in a way my parents never had. As we swayed beneath the fairy lights, I realized something had shifted. They had walked away from me, but I had walked into a future I chose for myself. The next morning, when I turned my phone back on, it was flooded with missed calls and frantic messages. My parents had seen the photo, and suddenly, they were desperate to talk. What they didn't know was that for once, I wasn't. What mattered now was how far they would go to prove their sudden change of heart, and whether it had anything to do with love at all. When I finally turned my phone back on after the wedding, it lit up like a Christmas tree. Dozens of missed calls, texts piling on top of each other, my parents' names filling the screen in desperate repetition. Call us immediately. Emily, this is urgent. We need to talk about Daniel. The same people who had told me they would not be embarrassed by me were now clawing their way back into my life, all because of one photo. I ignored them through our honeymoon, determined not to let their sudden interest poison the joy Daniel and I had built. But the moment we returned home, the pressure escalated. My mother left a voicemail dripping with false warmth. Darling, your father and I would love to take you and Daniel to dinner. It's important. Her tone was too bright, too careful, the kind she used when she wanted something. Against my better judgment, I agreed. But I refused to meet them at their usual haunts. If this conversation was going to happen, it would happen on my terms. I invited them to our apartment. The night they arrived, I watched them walk through the door with the same regal airs they wore at charity galas. My mother clutched a glossy gift bag. My father carried a bottle of vintage champagne. Their smiles were too polished, their posture too stiff. For a moment, I almost laughed. They looked like actors trying to play the role of loving parents. Emily, Daniel, my mother said, leaning in for a hug. I returned stiffly. We're so sorry we missed the wedding. We felt just awful. I motioned them inside. Would you like something to drink? My voice was cool, formal, as if I were greeting business clients rather than family. We sat in the living room, the silence thick beneath the shallow small talk. My parents commented on the view from our modest window, on the decor, on the wine we poured. But I could feel it building the moment when the performance would break, when their real agenda would show itself. And it did. My father cleared his throat. Daniel, we owe you an apology. We misjudged you. Clearly you're not what we assumed. His eyes darted toward me, as if hoping I would fill the silence with gratitude. I didn't. Then my mother leaned forward, her smile tightening. If we had known about your MIT background, your company, we never would have dismissed you. You must understand, appearances matter in our world. The words hit me like a slap. They weren't apologizing for the way they treated me, for the humiliation at family dinners, for abandoning me on my wedding day. They were apologizing for underestimating Daniel's economic value. My anger burned, but before I could speak, Daniel's calm voice cut in. Interesting, you should bring that up, Richard. Hydrosave just secured development rights for the Mission Bay waterfront project. I saw the blood drain from my father's face. That project had been his white whale for years, a cornerstone deal that could have cemented Carter Real Estate's dominance in San Francisco. That's unexpected, he managed, tugging at his tie. Daniel smiled politely. Our investors felt it was the perfect showcase for sustainable technology. We'll be outfitting the entire district with hydro-save systems. My mother's eyes flicked rapidly between my father and Daniel, calculating. I knew that look. They weren't here for reconciliation. They were here for opportunity. That's wonderful, she said quickly. Perhaps that makes even more sense for our families to work together. A partnership could be mutually beneficial. Something inside me snapped. So that's why you're here? My voice shook, but it was steady enough to make them both freeze. You missed my wedding. You disrespected my husband. You told me you wouldn't be embarrassed with me. And now, suddenly, because you think Daniel might benefit your business, you want back in? My father shifted uncomfortably. Emily, business and family are complicated. Sometimes they overlap. No, I said, my voice rising. This isn't complicated. You've always valued status, money, and appearances over character, love, and family. You don't want to make things right. You want to make a deal. For once, my parents had no clever retort. They sat in silence, their polished smiles cracking at the edges. Daniel reached for my hand, grounding me as he always did, his calm presence a stark contrast to the tension filling the room. When they finally left, subdued and uncertain, I closed the door behind them and leaned against it, my heart still pounding. For the first time in my life, I hadn't just stood up to them. I had called them out for exactly who they were. But even as relief washed over me, I knew this wasn't the end. Because in a family like mine, power was never surrendered without a fight. And the next twist was already waiting, one that would come not from my parents, but from Olivia. It was late one night when my phone rang, its shrill sound slicing through the quiet of our apartment. Daniel was asleep beside me, his steady breathing a contrast to the panic in my chest when I saw the name flashing on the screen. Olivia. My sister never called me. She texted when she needed something superficial, sent photos of dresses, or bragged about her travels, but never called. That night, she did. Emily, she said the moment I answered. Her voice was raw, shaky, stripped of the confidence she usually wore like a crown. I need your help. I sat upright, my heart pounding. What happened? She broke then, the sound of her sobs filling my ear. Ethan, he's being investigated. Financial fraud. The FBI raided our apartment this morning. They took everything. Emily, I don't know what to do. I felt the air leave my lungs. Ethan, the golden fiancé, the pride of my parents, the man they had paraded as the perfect match, he was a fraud. Literally. My parents had worshipped him, invested their pride and trust in him, while dismissing Daniel as if he were nothing. And now, here was Olivia, her world crumbling, her voice breaking. Do you need somewhere to stay? I asked, the words leaving me before I had time to second guess. There was silence, then a small, hesitant whisper. Would you really let me? After everything I've done to you and Daniel? Her question cut deeper than I expected. Memories of her smug smiles at family dinners, her digs about Daniel's job, her role in echoing our parents' cruelty, all of it flashed through me. But then I thought of her crying, broken, stripped of all the armor our parents had given her. And I thought of what Daniel had once told me. Love wasn't conditional. Yes, I said firmly. Come here. The next morning, she arrived with 2 suitcases and a face I barely recognized. The perfectly styled hair was gone, her designer clothes wrinkled from being thrown together in a rush. She looked smaller somehow, fragile, as though the scaffolding of privilege had collapsed around her. Living with us was a shock for her. Gone were the catered dinners and doormen. Instead, she watched Daniel and me cook together in our small kitchen, pay bills at the dining table, laugh over burnt toast, and build a life grounded not in appearances but in respect. At first, she sat silently, her eyes darting as if she didn't belong. Then, slowly, she began to talk. You're actually happy, she said one evening, as we shared takeout containers. Her voice held a note of disbelief. Not Instagram happy, not look at me happy, just happy. Too. I looked at her and smiled. That's the difference, Olivia. We don't live for anyone else's approval. She bit her lip, tears brimming. I thought I was doing it right. That if I played their game, married the right man, lived the right life, I'd finally feel whole. But now everything's gone, and I don't even know who I am without it. Her words broke something in me. For so long, I had seen her as my rival, the golden child who got everything I never did. But sitting across from me, she wasn't the golden child. She was just my sister, lost and hurting. Meanwhile, the scandal grew. News outlets covered Ethan's schemes, exposing a web of lies that implicated not just him but people connected to him, including Carter Real Estate. For the first time, my parents were forced into silence, their empire under scrutiny, their reputation crumbling. One night, Olivia confessed, her voice barely audible. I never even knew what he was doing. He'd hand me papers, and I'd sign them. I thought he loved me. Daniel leaned across the table, his voice calm but steady. Con men are good at what they do. It's not your fault, Olivia. I watched her shoulders shake as she cried, and I realized something I never thought I would. Olivia wasn't my enemy. She was a casualty of the same system that had nearly broken me. Our parents' obsession with appearances, their blindness to what really mattered. But while Olivia's fall shook the foundation of our family, it was only the beginning. Because the scandal that destroyed her marriage was about to tear into my parents' empire as well, and soon they would face a reckoning no amount of money or charm could shield them from. The headlines hit like a tidal wave. Whitmore under federal investigation. Within days, Ethan's polished image collapsed into dust. The FBI laid out evidence of shell companies, fraudulent loans, and a Ponzi scheme run through the Whitmore hotel empire. But the shock that rocked me the most wasn't Ethan's betrayal, it was how deeply he had entangled my parents' company in his schemes. Carter Real Estate, the empire my parents had spent decades building, was suddenly front-page news for all the wrong reasons. Investigators revealed that several of Ethan's investments were funneled through Carter Developments. Whether my parents had been complicit or simply careless no longer mattered. Their name was now tied to fraud. Overnight, the Carters' perfect reputation began to rot. I remember watching the news with Olivia beside me, her face pale, her eyes hollow. She hadn't slept in days. "They'll throw me under the bus too," she whispered. "They'll do anything to save themselves." I wanted to argue, but I knew she was right. Our parents had always been ruthless when protecting their image. As the investigation deepened, their empire began to unravel. Long-time associates distanced themselves, partnerships dissolved, clients canceled contracts. Even the charities they had once flaunted began returning donations, unwilling to be tainted by scandal. For the first time in my life, my parents weren't the admired Carters of Pacific Heights. They were pariahs. The moment that seared itself into my memory came on a crisp October morning. I drove past the mansion I had grown up in, its tall iron gates now open, a for sale sign planted firmly in the front yard. Movers carried boxes out through the grand double doors. My mother stood on the steps, her usual immaculate hair limp around her face. My father was beside her, his shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before. They didn't notice me as I slowed at the curb, but I noticed them. They looked small, shrunken, stripped of the armor they had always worn. Part of me felt vindicated. For years, they had belittled me, dismissed Daniel, and idolized a man who turned out to be a criminal. Now their empire was collapsing, their perfect facade shattered. But another part of me, smaller, quieter, felt a pang of sadness. They were still my parents, no matter how broken they had left me. That night, Olivia and I sat in my kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence between us. She pushed her tea away and whispered, "Do you think they'll ever change?" I didn't answer immediately. I thought about all the times they had chosen appearances over love, status over family. I thought about the coldness in my mother's voice when she told me she wouldn't be embarrassed by me. And yet, seeing them reduced to shadows of themselves, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, losing everything might force them to see what really mattered. But change never comes without resistance, and I knew my parents too well. They weren't going to surrender their pride easily. They would fight to hold on to what little power they still had, even if it meant grasping at straws. And soon, that fight would bring them back to my doorstep, not as the invincible Carters of my childhood, but as people desperate to cling to whatever pieces of control they could salvage. As Olivia rinsed her mug and turned off the light, I felt it in my bones. Their reckoning had only just begun. And whether I liked it or not, I was going to be part of it. In the wake of my parents' collapse, Life for me and Daniel began to bloom in ways I had never imagined. While their empire was crumbling, ours was just beginning to take shape, not built on prestige or appearances, but on something far sturdier: integrity, love, and hard work. Hydrosave launched its first production line that spring, and the impact was immediate. Demand grew faster than projections, and industry leaders began to take notice. Newspapers that had once featured Olivia's lavish parties and my parents' social triumphs were now writing articles about Daniel's invention, calling it a game changer for urban sustainability. I remember standing in our small office one evening, stacks of blueprints and contracts piled around us, when Daniel looked up from his desk, his eyes tired but glowing with pride. "Emily, we're not just building a company, we're building something that matters." At the same time, my own career had begun to shift. My firm promoted me to senior consultant, giving me the chance to lead projects focused on sustainable investments. I wasn't just advising clients on numbers anymore, I was helping them build portfolios that aligned profit with purpose. It felt like a perfect symmetry. Daniel was changing the way people used water, and I was changing the way they thought about money. Together, we were carving out a legacy that was ours, untethered from the Carter name. When we bought our first home, a charming Victorian in the Berkeley Hills, I felt something settle in me. It wasn't the size of the house that mattered, it was the feeling of walking through a door that we had unlocked together. Every piece of furniture, every painting on the wall, every plant by the window carried a story of choice, of partnership. This wasn't a house meant to impress, it was a home meant to live in. Olivia, too, was finding her own way. Living with us had stripped away the illusions she had built her life around, and though the process was painful, it gave her something my parents never had: perspective. With Daniel's encouragement and my quiet support, she began to rebuild, not by chasing another wealthy husband, but by working. She found a job in marketing, and eventually, she launched a nonprofit to help women who had been financially devastated by fraud or abusive relationships. One evening, as she told me about her first success story, a woman who had escaped a toxic marriage and was now financially independent, I saw something in Olivia I had never seen before: pride that wasn't borrowed from anyone else. It was as if the three of us, me, Daniel, and Olivia, were creating a new kind of family. A family built not on appearances, but on resilience, not on judgment, but on empathy. And it gave me hope, because if Olivia could change, maybe, just maybe, my parents could too. But as our lives flourished, I could feel their absence pressing in like a shadow. The Carters were no longer the untouchable icons of San Francisco society. They had lost the mansion, the vineyard, the business contracts. They had been stripped of everything but their pride. And I knew my parents well enough to understand that pride could be the heaviest anchor of all. One quiet evening, as Daniel and I stood on our porch, watching the city lights shimmer in the distance, he wrapped his arm around me and said, "You know, Emily, legacies aren't just what we inherit. They're what we choose to build." 8M. I nodded, my eyes stinging with tears. For so long I had believed my legacy was tied to the Carter name, to their empire, to their approval. But standing there with Daniel, with Olivia finding her strength inside our walls, I finally understood. I wasn't carrying their legacy anymore. I was creating my own. What I didn't know then was that my parents weren't finished with us. Stripped of their empire, they would soon come back into my life, not as the powerful Carters of old, but as people forced to confront the wreckage of what they had built. And the question waiting for me would be one I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. Could I let them back in? It had been nearly a year since my parents lost everything when the call finally came. My father's voice, once commanding and clipped, now sounded older, thinner, stripped of its sharp edges. "Emily," he said, "your mother and we'd like to see you, if you'll allow it." For a long moment, I just held the phone against my ear, my heart racing. All my life I had longed to hear those words, and yet now that they were here, I didn't trust them. Still, something in his tone, fragile, almost pleading, made me say yes. When they arrived at our Berkeley home, I barely recognized them. My father, who had always filled every room with his presence, looked smaller somehow, as though the weight of his failures had bent his shoulders. My mother, once flawless in designer gowns and diamond jewelry, appeared softer, her hands nervously clutching one another. They weren't the Carters of Pacific Heights anymore. They were just Charles and Victoria, two people stripped of their kingdom. We sat in the living room, Daniel beside me, silent but steady. The air was heavy with all the things left unsaid. Finally, my father cleared his throat, his voice breaking. "We've been doing a lot of thinking, about values, about family, about what we've done. What we've done." My mother's eyes filled with tears. The people we thought were our friends vanished the moment things got hard. All those years we spent trying to impress them, and when it mattered, they turned their backs on us. But you took Olivia in. You gave her a home when we wouldn't. That's what family is supposed to mean. Her words cracked something inside me. For years, I had carried the wound of their neglect, their dismissal of my worth. Hearing my mother admit it was like salt and balm at the same time, painful, but healing. "We were wrong, Emily," my father continued. "Wrong about Daniel? Wrong about what makes a successful life. We can't ask for forgiveness, not yet. But we want a chance. A chance to do better. To be the parents you deserved." I sat there frozen, torn between anger and compassion. Part of me wanted to shout, to list every wound they had inflicted. Another part, the little girl who had always longed for their love, wanted to fall into their arms. I looked at Daniel. His calm gaze met mine, a quiet reminder. The choice was mine. Finally, I spoke. "I can't pretend the past didn't happen. The old normal wasn't healthy. But maybe we can try to build something new, something better." Relief washed over their faces, tentative, but real. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. The road ahead was not smooth. There were awkward dinners where silence stretched too long, old habits that resurfaced, sharp words spoken by mistake. But slowly, painfully, we began to rebuild. My parents started therapy, facing the shadows of their own childhoods that had shaped their obsession with status. They listened more, asked questions instead of assuming. For the first time in my life, I felt them trying not to mold me, but to know me. And with time, they began to know Daniel too. Not Daniel the plumber, not Daniel the CEO, just Daniel the man who loved me with patience and steadiness, the man who built a company to make the world better. They came to respect him not because of what he achieved, but because of how he lived. The day I told them I was pregnant, my mother wept openly, clutching my hands. "We want to be the kind of grandparents who love unconditionally," she whispered. My father, his voice thick, added, "The kind we should have been as parents." For the first time, I let myself believe them. But reconciliation is not a single moment. It's a fragile, ongoing choice, one that demands patience and faith. And just as we began to settle into this new rhythm, life handed us the next chapter, one that would test everything we had rebuilt and force us to decide what kind of legacy we wanted to leave behind. Looking back now, I realize my story was never just about love or family drama. It was about my worth, and how long it took me to finally claim it for myself. For years, I let my parents define me through their narrow lens of success. I believed if I earned more, worked harder, looked shinier, maybe they would finally see me. But the truth is, no amount of effort could have filled a void created by their own limitations. It took being rejected on the most important day of my life to see clearly. When my parents chose not to show up at my wedding, I thought it was the end of something. In reality, it was the beginning. Because that day, I stopped waiting for their approval, and I started living by my own values. Building a life with Daniel taught me that real success has nothing to do with appearances. It's not the size of your house or the number in your bank account that defines you. It's the quality of your love, the way you treat people when nobody's watching, the quiet pride in knowing you've built something with honesty and heart. Watching him turn a simple plumbing business into a groundbreaking company while staying true to who he was reminded me that dignity comes from character, not credentials. Even Olivia's fall became part of my awakening. For so long, I saw her as the favored one, the golden child who got everything I didn't. But when her world collapsed, I saw how fragile that kind of validation really was. She had been just as trapped as I was, only in a different cage. And when she finally found her own purpose helping women reclaim their independence, it showed me that redemption is always possible, no matter where you start. As for my parents, their reckoning was brutal but necessary. They lost their empire, their reputation, and the social circle they had worshipped for decades. And in that loss, they found something they had never given themselves permission to feel before: humility. Rebuilding with them hasn't been easy, and I'd be lying if I said the past no longer hurt. But for the first time, I see them trying to love without conditions, and that in itself is healing. If there's one lesson my journey has etched into me, it's this: your worth is not a reflection of anyone else's opinion. It isn't measured by what your parents say, by the labels society gives you, or by the boxes people try to put you in. Worth is something you claim the moment you decide to live authentically, without apology. To anyone listening who has felt invisible, unworthy, or dismissed, please hear me. You are enough exactly as you are. You don't need to prove yourself to people who refuse to see you. The people who matter will value you not for your resume, your paycheck, or your family name, but for your heart, your strength, and your truth. So live your life in a way that feels true to you. Build the kind of legacy that reflects your values, not the ones handed down to you. Because in the end, that's the only legacy that will matter. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. And I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to stand up for your own worth when others refused to see it? What did you discover about yourself in the process? Share your story in the comments below. I promise, you never know who might need the courage of your words.